Good morning. Good morning. I don't know why the internet regularly needs me to restart my computer to go live, but here we are. I'm also happy I'm on the right channel. Last week I accidentally went on to last week I accidentally posted to my personal page, which is basically videos of my children for the sake of my mother-in-law and my mom. Grandparents get to watch the grandkids grow up, and so I posted it there, and I was wondering why we had like one person who was on watching, but that was why. So good morning. The internet, every single week it requires me to start over, but here we are. So we're going to start right up. We're already 3 minutes over. Depending on what copy or version you have of this, if you have this version here, which is very common, I'll be on page 115. If not, part 3, chapter 1, and the title is You Can't Win an Argument. So let's start out by praying, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you so much for your grace and your mercy. And we pray, Lord, that you'd help us to gain discernment and wisdom as we try to learn from this text. It's got a lot of wisdom in it. And we just pray, Lord, you'd help us to apply it to our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. So starting out here, he says, you can't win an argument. And this portion of this book was probably the most influential for me when I first read it. I first read this book when I was graduating from my master's, and I fell into all of the things he says you should not do in this portion here. And a good friend of mine who actually gave me this book, his name is Lance. He's actually signed it and gave me a little thing saying here, congratulations on graduating. And he says, quit being such a jerk. And he gave me this book and said, you should read this. It would help you to, do better in life. And I humbly accepted, and he was 100% correct. And he just finished his PhD just this last year. So during the pandemic. So, that was kind of sucked for him, but I was glad he was able to finish. So here we are. He says here, you can't win an argument. So he's talking to this guy who was a World War I fighter pilot, and he was at this guy's place. The guy also flew around the world, across the ocean and everything in 30 days. He was a big deal. Sir Ross Smith, he was knighted. He was a very famous guy during the writing of this. If I said to the average person on the street, you know who Sir Ross Smith is? No one would know who he is, but he's very famous at this time. And we see that Dale Carnegie is at his house, and the guy quotes this. He says, there is divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. And the guy said, yeah, the Bible's great. The Bible says that. And immediately Dale Carnegie, who was a Christian and knows the Bible, says, no, that's not in the Bible. And it ends up that it's not in the Bible. It's actually Shakespeare. The Bible doesn't say that. Similarly, we have friends who will say, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sure, but that's not in the Bible. So be very careful how you're quoting scripture. But anyway, he's in this guy's house. He's having these conversations. He's this guy's guest. And the guy was immediately offended by him saying, no, you're wrong. His friend, who was a Shakespeare expert, who happened to be at the meeting as well, and I don't agree with this, he actually says, Dale, you're wrong. It was in the Bible, knowing full well that it wasn't. So this guy actually lied and said that, oh yeah, it's in the Bible, just to appease this guy's ego. I don't care for that, but he's right. You should not confront somebody, and for what reason? And I love these questions. And this is what was hard for me to learn when I first became a Christian, and when I was learning and growing in my faith and understanding of who I was as well. And I remember getting into arguments with people and just defending the truth. The truth was the big thing for me. And part of the problem is that we've been talking about at church for a while now, is that ideas don't save you. So it's relationship. It's a relationship with Christ that saves you. It's not the idea of Jesus. It's not some kind of anecdote about the Bible. It's not any particular idea or belief even. It's a relationship. So he asks these questions. He says, why prove a man he's wrong? Like, why are you doing this? I mean, there are times where you need to prove somebody wrong, but why in this instance do you feel the need to correct this guy in his house when he misquotes a verse? Who cares if he misquotes? It's not end of the world stuff. He says, is that going to make him like you? Why not let him save face? Which is very important. You should let the person save face if possible. He didn't ask for your opinion, so why argue with him? And I think that's really important. I think that part of the problem is that it's our egos. I know we want to say, oh, I'm really concerned about the truth and I want to make sure people know the truth and all this stuff. But I think more than likely, oftentimes, we just like being right. And so when we hear somebody say something that's wrong and we know it's wrong, or we think we know it's wrong, because we can also be wrong. When we tell them, well, actually, it was this, you're doing that for yourself. You're not doing that for them most of the time. There are times where you have a really good friend you can take aside and there's confrontation that needs to happen. That does need to happen sometimes. But this is talking about how to win friends and influence people. This is not going to your brother and sister in the Lord who you've built a relationship with and confronting them on their sin. That's not what this book is for. This book is for your day-to-day existence of just being at the bank and going to the Hy-Vee and just dealing with people at a party. Remember parties? Remember when we used to shake hands with people and be in a house with people we didn't know? Nowadays, if you have 6 people in your house, you know them very well, and you probably trust that they're staying safe elsewhere, and that's why they're in your house. But this book, we got to remember, we are reading this book to prepare us for when this ends and we can finally start reaching people with the gospel again. We can't hide in our houses forever, and praise Jesus, we can finally get out and start talking to people again and inviting people to church. But again, if you're in line at Hy-Vee and somebody misquotes scripture, is correcting them really going to bring them to church on Sunday? You have to ask these kinds of questions. He says here, there's only one way under high heaven to get the best of an argument, and that's to avoid it. He says 9 times out of 10, an argument ends with each of the contestants more firmly convinced than ever that he is absolutely right. I'm reading another book. I talked about it last week. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's a Nobel Prize winner, and he's explaining how we think in these different systems and how our unconscious and conscious mind works. And in it, he talks a lot about confirmation bias. And it's important for us to recognize the fact that we all suffer from confirmation bias. And what that means is, well, there's lots of stuff, but basically for our purposes, when you think you know something, it kind of attaches to your ego. Every little bit of information you hold to be true becomes a part of who you are in a very real way. So when somebody confronts an idea you think is true and they tell you it's false, we oftentimes as human beings, we tend to feel as though we are being personally attacked, even though it's not us, it's the idea that we hold to be true. But the real thing is that we don't want to be stupid. We don't want to be wrong. And we fight tooth and nail. And oftentimes we'll even fight when we realize we are wrong because we don't want to lose face. We don't want to be wrong. It's part of our egos. And he says that when he says 9 times out of 10, the argument actually makes people feel like they're even more right. People will argue with you. If you're a jerk and you're just arguing for the sake of arguing, people will argue with you just purely to not agree with you, just purely to not give you the satisfaction of being right. Go on to almost any comment section on Facebook or Twitter or whatever and read the arguments, and it's obvious that no one's being persuaded. Everybody's being angry. He says here, he was teaching this one guy. He says Patrick O'Hare joined his class. He had been a chauffeur, but now he was working for the White Truck Company. White Truck, not white trucks as in the color white, but the guy, I think the company owner's name was White. So they're White Trucks, White Motor Company. And the guy says that he was trying to sell trucks, but every time somebody would say, it'd be like going to a Chevy dealership and being like, man, the last Chevy you guys produced was crap. If the salesperson immediately started to defend the brand and started arguing about how ridiculous you are to even think that, you're obviously not going to buy their car. So he says, my first problem was not, this is Dale Carnegie speaking, my first problem was not to teach Patrick to talk. He says, my first task was to train him to refrain from talking and avoid verbal fights. This actually might come up in the sermon on Sunday. He says that the guy was going to argue, blah, 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 blah. He says the who's-its are made by a fine. So he says what he learned was rather than argue, when somebody said, hey, I'd rather go to, Ford and get a truck. The white motor cars are garbage. I want to go to Ford. And he said, this is how he changed it. He says for example, the Ford cars are made by a fine company and sold by good people. And he says, when he said that, his opponent, the person who was being cantankerous and a little grumpy, immediately was kind of like dumbfounded, because you're agreeing with me. What do I say now? If somebody's arguing with you and you agree with them, then there's nothing more to really argue about. And he says this left the man speechless. There's no room for an argument. He can't keep on all afternoon saying this is the best when I'm agreeing with him that it is the best. And then he says, as I look back now, I wonder how I was ever able to sell anything. I lost so many years of my life scrapping and arguing. I keep my mouth shut now, and it pays. Literally pays in dividends and cash. When I was in high school, one of my friends, Martin, his nickname for me was Scrappy Doo, because I was the shortest of my friends, and I would get into fights all the time. So physical fights, not just verbal fights. So he called me Scrappy Doo. So if you're unfamiliar with this concept of scrapping, that's what he means. He means arguing and fighting. It's one of those old phrases that have been lost in time. Ben Franklin says this: if you argue and rankle, there's another old word. If you argue and rankle and contradict, you may achieve a victory sometimes, but it will be an empty victory because you will never get your opponent's goodwill. And again, as Christians, our goal is not to be right. It should not be to be right. Our goal should be to help people meet Jesus. That's our goal. That's our purpose. Our purpose is not to be right. So for us, we want to make sure that we are trying to help the other person. So my daughter, Nina, was actually just learning this lesson. She's read through this book with me. She's not done with it yet, but she's in the process. And she was working with a team project that was due yesterday. And she was stressing out because one of the other students was not doing anything, literally had done nothing. And I kept telling her, I'm like, you focus on your stuff. She kind of took over and said, okay, she started just telling people what to do because people wouldn't commit to doing anything. They didn't make a slideshow. So Nina created like 7-8 slides, and she said, fine. She actually divvied up the slides she had created and gave them out to the other students and said, these are what you're doing. Create your lesson and be prepared to present. And it just got to the point where she was basically doing their work. And I said to Nina, baby, you can't do that because it doesn't help this particular kid. Like everybody else did work, but this one kid did only touched the project the night before. And everybody else had like 4 slides. This kid had 1. I mean, so this kid obviously didn't care. So I said, but she's like, well, I'm trying to help him. I said, but honey, the thing is you're not really helping him. By doing the work for him, you're not helping him at all. It would be better for him, this kid, to you do what you can to help to an extent, but you got to let the kid fail. You got to let the kid show up on the day of and just fail. Because the thing is that actually helps him to grow. If everybody just continues for the rest of his life, because obviously that's what's been going on because he's just not doing his work, or he's not interested in the topic, I guess, too. But if everybody keeps doing his job for him, which seems like that's what's been happening, he's never going to learn to do the job himself. And I said to Nina, it's counterintuitive, but sometimes you got to do what's right for the other person, even if it's painful, even if it's hard. And and that's just one of those situations where you don't have to be rude, but you don't have to do everybody else's work. And he goes on here and he talks about the importance of appreciation again. We talked about this a couple chapters ago, and trying to influence and trying to encourage people like, hey, I appreciate the little bit of work you've done, trying to get them to just understand you really legitimately do, and don't lie, but legitimately appreciate them. And he says this, Mr. Parsons is speaking to an inspector of wood. It's a wood inspector. And these still exist. So this again sounds very old fashioned, but these exist. So I worked at a factory for trim and wood, and quality control was my job. And I would literally have to open up boxes and look to see if the product was good enough to be used for our purposes. And there were a handful of times where I had to go, this whole entire pallet is garbage. We have to send it back. It's not going to work for us because we can't use it for our purposes. So he had a guy like that, who kept just returning stuff and telling him it's garbage. And he says, I suppose this is a very petty matter of comparison. And he talks about just how ridiculous this is. But he understands that. He says, hey, I appreciate everything you're doing. And he says, I want to just give this guy the feeling of importance, because that's what he wants. He wants this feeling of importance. This actually is, I don't think this is the story of the, nope, this is the tax consultant. The wood guy will come up later. But the point is that we have this feeling of importance. We have egos. We want to feel like we're doing a good job. We want to feel like we're doing well. And he was just trying to help this tax inspector guy feel that. He's like, hey, man, I appreciate everything you do. And I'm sure that you fall into all kinds of problems and have to deal with all kinds of awful people. I can't even imagine what you go through. I'm kind of interested in some of the stories. The guy started telling him stories. Pretty soon, tax problem gone. So on the next page, 120, says, misunderstanding is never ended by an argument, but by tact, diplomacy, conciliation, and a sympathetic desire to see the other person's point of view. If everybody just was trying very hard to see the other person's point of view, 90% of our arguments, debates, and fights and wars would go away. So he has here this article from Bits and Pieces. And if you haven't highlighted and underlined this, it's so good. There's just a whole bunch of stuff here. He says, first of all, it's a lot about changing your attitude. So it says here, welcome the disagreement. That was a hard one for me because I had to get to the point where I'm like, you know what? I became a Christian because at some point I had to admit I was wrong about my worldview. But if that was so life-changing, why aren't I more open to hearing other people's arguments? I mean, what if my opinion about X, Y, and Z has been wrong for years, and somebody else has the opportunity to tell me I was wrong? And man, imagine how much better my life could be if I chose to do X instead of Y. So I started to get to a point where I welcomed disagreement, and that's hard. But it says here, be thankful that a person has brought your attention to something. He says, perhaps this disagreement is your opportunity to be corrected on a serious matter. And I have been wrong so many times. I would imagine that maybe you have too. You guys are probably smarter than I am. But, we have been wrong. Why would we be shocked if we're wrong again? So why not just assume that maybe you're wrong? Have some humility and go, hey, I could learn something. Distrust your first instinct and your first impression. This is very important. We need to recognize that we have confirmation bias. We need to recognize that we all have stereotypes and other types of biases as well. We need to recognize the fact that our egos and our emotions and our belief systems are so grounded in our culture and in our upbringing and all kinds of things. We need to be very careful to I don't want you to be hypercritical of yourself, but I do want you to have a healthy sense of understanding that, your views, your opinions may be wrong. And that's hard to do, but you have to try to fight. And, if you feel like, that's right or wrong or evil or bad or whatever, just stop and go from the other person's perspective. Maybe I'm wrong. And just try to distrust your first impression. Your gut reaction is not always the right one. Control your temper, obviously. Listen first. Give your opponent a chance to talk. Let them finish. This is hard, but this helps build bridges. When somebody's arguing with you, even if you know without a doubt that you're 100% correct, you need to stop and just let the person finish. Again, you're not being convinced by their argument. You don't agree with them, and let's say they're 100% wrong. But at the end of the day, what is your purpose for having this conversation? Your goal should be to help them grow and mature and help them become a better person. That should be your goal, not to be right. And are they going to listen to you better or more intently or more intentionally if you interrupt them and argue, or if you just let them get their thoughts out? Let them rationalize. Let them try to explain themselves. And oftentimes, I've done this before where somebody has come to me with a complaint or they're angry about something. And I've listened and just genuinely cared about their feelings and their thoughts. And there have been times where I've had conversations where the person was talking to me and explaining to me the situation. And then by the time they were done explaining it to me, they'd already decided that they were wrong. Because as they said it, and I was just really listening and going, yeah, okay, asking questions, all right, they began to come to the conclusion themselves that this particular argument they were having was wrong. Be honest. Look for areas of agreement. This is just this is just apologetics 101. Looking for areas of agreement is just finding a common ground, is what we call it in apologetics a lot of times. It's just, okay, what can we agree on? Let's start with what we can agree on. Because if we have nothing we can agree on, then we have nothing to talk about. Because if we literally don't agree on anything, then there's nothing to be discussed. We're speaking a different language. But let's be honest, even the most grumpy atheist and the most grumpy Christian have things they can agree on. There are some things we agree on. The water's wet and rocks are hard. Pizza is good on occasion. I mean, there's lots of things that we can agree on. So try to find something you agree on, then start to have a conversation. Promise to think over your opponent's ideas and study them carefully and mean it. This is one of the hardest ones because we don't want to be wrong and we don't want to put extra effort, but other people are worth the time. I don't know how many times I've had people argue with me, especially in seminary and college. And I went to a non-Christian college. I went to UW-Madison for philosophy. So I was the Lone Ranger in a Christian in a philosophy program at a school not known for Christianity. And I regularly had to eat crow and deal with the mockery of my professors. But I didn't disrespect them. I didn't argue with them. And when they said that I was being an idiot and that I should read Nietzsche, I said, okay, and I read Nietzsche. One of my professors said that I should read Ernst Bloch, which is a communist writer. a socialist writer. He's a communist. But he said that, your Christianity and this and this and this doesn't really play out in the real world. You should read this book. And I said, hey, I'll read this book if you and I can get together and discuss it. He said, okay. So I read the book, and then him and I, this is a law professor. I was taking law classes. This law professor and I went out for lunch, and we discussed Ernst Bloch, and I got an A in his class, even though I completely disagreed with him. But proving that you care about somebody by actually engaging their ideas, no better way to earn somebody's trust. Postpone action to give both sides time to think through the problem. This is a great comment. It's also amazing when it comes to your marital issues or close relationship issues. Looks like Mason passed his driver's test 100%. Awesome. Good job, Mason. He just had his driver's test today. Nice. He just sent me a picture. Awesome. Now he wants to drive my car. Now I got to add him to my insurance, and now my insurance is going to go up. Principle 1. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. And then when it says postpone action, this is one of those things where in marital counseling, I always teach my folks that you don't let the sun go down in your anger. That's a Bible verse. But that doesn't mean you come to a conclusion. You might have very differing views on, the number one reason for divorce is money. Number one reason, statistically speaking, any psychologist marital counseling psychologist will tell you that sex and money are number one. And so, for example, if one person says, I want to buy a house in the country and have a 4-car garage, and the other one says, I want to have a condo in town and not have to mow the lawn. Both have benefits, both have pros and cons, both have their own issues. You're not going to solve that in a night. That's not a situation where that argument, letting the sun go down in your anger, you're not going to sit down and pound that out and solve that in an afternoon. But you can both agree to disagree for a time. And then it says take time for both sides to reflect. Write down literally the pros and cons. Really think about what is best for you. What's best for you in 5 years? What's best for you, meaning the couple, you. What's best for you in 5 years? What's best for your future family, your future children? Maybe even, depending on where you're at in life, maybe your grandkids. Sean and I were looking at buying we have a pop-up, and we were looking at campers. And, I find myself going, well, you know what? If Nina stays the course that her mom and I did, we could have a grandkid in 5 years, which is just ridiculous. I'm not encouraging that. But and I was looking at campers, and I'm going, so if we had a grandkid, where would we put this kid? And I'm going, what the heck am I doing? Man, life goes fast. Number 2, chapter 2, a sure way of making enemies and how to avoid it. It says here, he says, and I love this. This is just a big, huge nugget of humility. This is a humble pill everybody should swallow. Theodore Roosevelt said something along the lines of, if he could be right 75% of the time, he'd be like the best president ever. And then he says, let's just really get down to brass tacks here. He says, if you could be sure that you were right 55% of the time on everything you think, like literally everything you think, 55% of the time you were right. He says, you could go to Wall Street, pick some stocks, and be a millionaire in a matter of days. If you really, and he's right. Statistically speaking, you're talking about, some of the odds that a casino has. The odds for a casino are stacked in their favor. They know that they're giving money away, but statistically speaking, they'll bring more money in. In the same way, if you literally think you're really, really, really intelligent, and you really literally think that you are correct 55% of the time on anything you think, he says you should be rich. He says, if you can't be sure of being right even 55% of the time, why are you telling other people that they're wrong all the time? And that was a huge humble pill that I think a lot of us, and that I had to swallow, because it's real. I mean, really, you might be an expert in your field, for example. So it's funny, is like Bill Nye and these other folks who have a specialty, and Tyson and other folks, you get all these people who are they have a specialty that they're really good at, and they're an expert. But then they start to, deal with other topics and other ideas, and then they start to throw their ideas out there as if they're an expert, and they're not. They're not an expert in other things. Bill Nye is a science guy. Praise God. He's great at that, but he's not a philosopher. He's not a theologian. So if Bill Nye throws out his idea about, he didn't do this, but if he throws out an idea about Bible interpretation, he's not an expert. He has no training whatsoever. He's right. He has a right to an opinion, but he also has to admit the fact that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't have the training that's required to be an authority on that topic. So any of us, at any given day, you could be Albert Einstein, but again, Albert Einstein probably didn't know how to fix his own car. He's building nuclear reactors, but he probably didn't know how to fabricate a transmission for his Ford Fairlane from rock and mortar and building it from the ground up. I mean, I have no idea about that thing either. But the point is that there's lots of stuff we're ignorant about. So if we're ignorant about lots of stuff, then we should just admit the fact and just recognize that maybe we're wrong. He says, you can tell people they are wrong by a look on your face, an intonation, a gesture. And this is true. I mean, that was one of the things I really had to fight, because I quit arguing with people. I should say that. I tried very hard, and I did cut back on arguing with people. But it's the face that you have to, it's your face that you really have to fight. When somebody says something, you're like, you give them like you're saying they're an idiot with your face, and you're not trying to, and you're trying very hard to be polite, but you're like, and that screams, that you think they're a moron. And he says, and you may hurl at them all the logic of Plato and Immanuel Kant, but you will not alter their opinions. You'll just hurt their feelings. So I actually have a book here. I have Immanuel Kant and I have Plato. And right here at my desk, I have Albert Camus' Being and Nothingness, which is the existentialism Bible, for example. But who cares? First of all, most people don't recognize Jean-Paul Sartre. Most people don't recognize Jean-Paul Sartre as an authority in anything. They probably don't even know who he is. Among philosophers, highly respected. I also have Kierkegaard and some other stuff too. But highly respected, whatever. At the end of the day, though, who cares? Just because I've read a whole bunch of stuff and I might lay out the best logical argument in the world, but at the end of the day, people are going to be offended if you tell them they're wrong. Again, there are times where you need to, but on a day-to-day basis, when you're in the line at Hy-Vee and somebody starts spouting off about politics or whatever, wouldn't it be better to build a relationship with that person and then eventually maybe help change their mind, rather than get into a debate about how Biden is doing X or how Trump did Y? If your goal is to win an argument, you're wrong. Jesus didn't put us here to win arguments. He put us here to win souls. And that's it. So he says, this is a challenge. It arouses opposition. My son is texting me because he wants to tell me how great he did. I got to tell him that I'm busy at the moment, and I will call him back in minutes. If you are going to prove anything, don't let anybody know it. Do it subtly, so that no one knows you're doing it. This is a really important point. And I again have done this many times with folks who are hostile. I'll have these conversations with them, and I'll listen and I'll listen and I'll listen, and I'll ask questions. And rather than tell the person they're wrong, I'll ask questions. It's called Socratic dialogue. And I'll ask questions to try to help them think about it. Oh, that's a really good point. What do you think about this? And then let them talk about it and think through it and process it. It says here, well, I can't hope to be any smarter than Socrates, the Socratic dialogue. He says, so I'm going to quit telling people that they're wrong. And he's absolutely right. He says, if a person makes a statement that you think is wrong, yes, even though you know it's wrong, isn't it better to say, well, now look. And here's a great example. He actually gives an example. He says, I thought otherwise, but I may be wrong. I frequently am. And if I am wrong, I want to put it right. Let's examine the facts together. Let's have a conversation together. And he says there's magic in such phrases as I may be wrong, I frequently am. Let's examine the facts. And I can tell you, especially during the pandemic, we've had so many people that are just angry. And oftentimes I'm a pastor. I represent religion. I represent authority. I represent all kinds of things. And people come at me and are angry about it. And I've without a doubt used this. And it's not manipulative. It is just me saying, hey, I have been wrong before. I am not a doctor. I don't know how many times I've said that in the last year. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I respect those people. I am following the guidelines as best I can based upon all of the people who are authorities in that topic, because I am not. But I am a pastor. I am an authority on that. I have training. I have done all that kind of work. At the end of the day, if a person in my congregation needs their pastor and they want me to come hold them because they are so distraught and sad and awful, just feeling so awful, despite whether or not the government tells me I can touch them or not, as a pastor, I will go to them and I will hug them. I will be with them if they need me. That is my role. I can't imagine dying and having Jesus look at me and go, Josh, you held that person while they cried. Why would you do that? I can't imagine Jesus saying that, but I can imagine Jesus saying, Josh, you're a pastor. You're supposed to love on people. You're supposed to comfort them. You're their shepherd. And you chose to not comfort them because of a rule that some government official made. Again, that doesn't mean that I, go against all the rules or whatever. Wearing a mask, doing all those things, social distancing, absolutely. Following the rules best I can. But at the end of the day, I'm not that. So he says, you'll never get in trouble when you admit you're wrong. You'll never admit if you admit you're wrong. Page 126 says here, few people are logical, and this is absolutely true. Sorry, 1 second. Few people are logical, without a doubt. The book that I'm reading right now, that's the main thrust of his argument, is that most people, we all think we're very intelligent, but in reality, the most of us, even the most intelligent of us, are actually just led by our emotions and our biases, the things that we believe to be true. Is most of us are blighted with preconceived notions, jealousy, suspicion, fear, envy, pride. And most citizens don't want to change their minds about their religion or their haircut or their communism or their favorite movie star. And that's his quote, not mine. And he's just making the point that people will argue with you and fight tooth and nail for the very important ideas like communism, but they will also fight tooth and nail if you criticize their haircut. And at the end of the day, why argue with them about any of that stuff? If you haven't built a relationship with them, why are you arguing with them in the first place? So he has this great quote from James Harvey Robinson. I'm not going to read the whole thing. He talks about Epictetus and the pronunciation of how to pronounce Epictetus. And he says, blah, 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 blah. He says, we like to continue to believe what we have been accustomed to accept as true. And the resentment aroused when doubt is cast upon any of our assumptions leads us to seek every manner of excuse for clinging to it. The result is that most of our so-called reasoning consists in finding arguments for going on believing as we already do. And that's what we end up doing. We want to find, confirmation bias is we are looking for information to confirm what we already believe. That's why there's such a problem with social media. Social media, Facebook and everything got in trouble during past elections because the algorithms in social media are designed to feed you information they know you like. So if you are a hardcore pro-choice person, the algorithms will give you pro-choice articles, pro-choice advertisements, pro-choice nonprofits. And on the flip side, if you are a hardcore Republican or pro-life or progressive or Democrat or whatever, what they do is they feed you information that they know you'll click on because that's what they're there for. They're there to make money by clicks. They make money for every click that you make. So, and every time you open an advertisement. So why would they give you information that you don't agree with? You know, if you're looking, like, again, I searched for campers 2 days ago. I haven't bought a camper. I just looked up campers. My feed on Google, and every time I open my cell phone and look at the news, in my feed, my news feed are, hey, top 9 places to go camping, top 10 places to drive an RV. They're giving me stuff that they think I'm interested in. That makes sense. That's good advertising. But we have to be very careful because that's a confirmation bias. If you are already pro-life or pro-choice or pro this or pro that or against this or that, we look for information to confirm that. We don't actually look at information. We don't normally look at information to disagree with it. Confirmation bias. Carl Rogers, great psychologist. I have one of his books right here. Says, I have found it an enormous value when I can permit myself to understand the other person. Very important. And then he says here, talking about Bill, and Bill says, yes. He says, yes. He says, somebody was confronted about the drapery, the window covering that he had bought. And he felt bad about paying so much money for these stupid window treatments. And somebody said, man, they saw him and go, oh my gosh, those are okay, but they're not great. And then he said, and then how much you pay for them? Holy cow, you were ripped off. And Carnegie says that he immediately felt like he needed to defend his choice. So he started to argue with the guy. And he said afterward, he's like, I don't know why I did that. And then afterward, somebody else came along, a friend, and sat there and was like, oh my gosh, man. Oh, you got new drapes. Awesome. Good for you. It's really cool. And rather than him having to argue with the person, he actually freely admitted that he paid too much for them because of real admiration and just a real conversation. That would have, if you're trying to, again, why are you trying to convince your friend that their drapes are ugly? I mean, if they are, they are. And what's it to you? Ben Franklin quote, always good. Feel free to read it. Ben Franklin says he was big enough and wise enough to realize that he was being confronted about his arrogance and about his, just drive to argue. And a good friend said to him, dude, no one wants to even talk to you. You're awful to be around. You're arrogant. You're grumpy. You want to be right all the time. For gosh sake, man. So he says, he was big enough and wise enough to admit the fact that this was true. And because he was confronted by a loving person, by a person who had built rapport, who was an authority in his life, who he respected, that actually changed his opinion. Wasn't some random guy on the street. And Franklin said, I made it a rule to forbear all direct contradiction to the sentiment of others and all positive assertion of my own. I even forbade myself from using every word or expression in the language to say certainly, undoubtedly. He just got rid of all that kind of like, without a doubt, I know this. I am 100% right. He got rid of all that language. He said, I replaced that language certainly and undoubtedly with I imagine, I think, I perceive, this is my opinion. He says, when another asserted something or I thought that was an error, I began by observing their way of looking at it. He said that I realized from a certain point of view, a lot of the things I disagreed with were true. And that's true. There are many times where somebody agrees with or disagrees with you on X, and from their perspective, it makes total sense. I can think of a lot of examples, but I don't want to say them because I don't want to offend anybody. He said because he was doing this, he said, I had less mortification when I was found to be in the wrong. And I more easily prevailed with others to give up their own mistakes and join me when I happened to be right. He says, it became at length so easy and so habitual. He says, and this habit, this changed his character and gave him integrity. So I just love this, Benjamin Franklin. If you've never read Benjamin Franklin, you can get it online for free because it's old enough that it's free. You can actually get the biography of Benjamin, his autobiography, and read about his life, and it's excellent. Really well done. Language is a little weird because it's a long time ago, but very well done. But his point is that he was able to make it a habit. And that's what our goal is. And my goal for you is to use this kind of information to become just a genuinely nicer person to everybody around you. So moving on. So he says here, he was talking to this guy, industrial engineer. He says, after several sessions of this course, I realized all too well where I had made my mistakes. I called another meeting, and this time I asked where they felt their problems were. So this woman had created this new system that was more productive and paid better. Everybody argued with her, but then her example is she called another meeting, discussed each of their points, didn't even mention hers. And then she says she introduced a few low-key suggestions at proper intervals. And she says, I let my system develop naturally in their minds by just asking a few questions and giving just a few suggestions. And eventually they happily accepted the new system because they had come to the conclusion on their own. Very common, again, Socratic dialogue. We see this in Plato's Republic, where Plato actually argued that all truth is innate. Like, we know truth, and we actually are just we're just remembering it when we learn it. We're not actually learning truth or learning information, learning knowledge. We're actually just remembering it. Very weird. Anyway, she says, I'm convinced now that nothing good is accomplished and a lot of damage can be done if you tell a person straight out that he or she is wrong. You strip the person of their self-dignity. Without a doubt, true. Jump ahead. So I think this is the lumber guy. Okay, so we're back to the lumber story. Like I said, I did this. This was a job I had. He says, by asking questions in a very friendly and cooperative spirit and insisting continually that they were right in laying boards that were not satisfactory aside. So he's not lying. He's just saying, if that board that I sent you is not satisfactory to your standards, then set it aside. If it doesn't work for your standards, you're you and I'm me. And you know yourself better than I do. Without a doubt, set it aside. And that's true. It's not manipulation. It's true. I changed his attitude. He says, and occasionally a carefully put remark gave birth to an idea in this person's mind, in this inspector's mind. that possibly some of the rejected pieces were actually within the grade that he had called for. So again, this is having to do with grades of wood. And this inspector had just been rejecting it wholesale. But what happened was he didn't know the difference between a hardwood and a pine. And this is true. Great example. When I worked in this factory, hardwoods are hard, literally harder. And like an oak is a very different kind of wood than pine. Oak boards were normally very straight and would come out really nice. But then we would put stain on them and heat them. And as you put stain on them, that soaks the wood, and then you heat them, which dries the stain. We would sometimes get wood that would bow. And when you're running a system with about this much gap, bowing could actually wreck the whole system. And pine is very different than oak. So we would have to run some of the pine to see how it would run on our line, because pine, again, if you don't know the difference, when pine gets wet, it gets more warped and bowed. And so we would have a whole bunch of boards that came out just straight as an arrow. But as soon as we ran it through the stain and ran it through the heaters, they would actually get stuck in the furnaces, because as they would dry, or as they got wet and dried, they would bow up like this. And so there were times where I had to a lot of times, like almost on a daily basis, I'd have to get some welding gloves, and I wasn't wearing a shirt normally because it's so hot. I'd grab welding gloves and take these huge doors off the furnaces, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of degrees of heat, just very quick heat to just sear it in. And we'd have to pull this wood out. And within 30 seconds, the wood would be on fire because it's so hot, because it was only meant to dry it for seconds. Like they shot through it so many hundreds of feet per second, and it would shoot out the other side and already be dry. If it got stuck, though, be burst into flames just because of the heat. And so we would have to go through, but pine and oak are completely different. They're completely different woods. And he said, this guy here knew hardwood, but didn't know pine that well. And he says, eventually the guy's attitude changed, and he had readily admitted that he had not experienced white pine and that he needed some assistance. And all of a sudden, not only he took the guy's advice that he used to reject, and then he now is actually, he took the entire load of wood, being like, I'm obviously, everything is good. I made a mistake. And he humbly accepted his mistake and changed his opinion. Awesome. That was the goal. The guy, both of the people grew from that circumstance. The guy who was adamant that this wood was garbage, he admitted that he needed to learn something about pine. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but when your job is wood inspection, probably important. This other guy learned patience and learned to keep his mouth shut and learned to help people grow. And that's the end game. His ultimate outcome was that he went through the entire carload again and left, accepted the whole lot, and I received a full paycheck. And he says, just like Jesus says, and Jesus said this, and this is true. He says, I agree with your adversary quickly. A lot more to that verse than that. But the point is, he says, in other words, don't argue with your customer or your spouse or your adversary. Don't tell them they're wrong. Don't get stirred up. Use diplomacy. And he says, principle number 2, show respect to other people's opinions. Never say you're wrong. Show respect to other people's opinions. That's the lesson for today. Show your respect to other people's opinions. And if you do, because people's opinions they're equal to the person's ego. If a person believes something to be true and you disagree with what they believe, you've attacked them as a person. That's how it feels. So the best thing to do would be to grow rapport and have a conversation. The Bible also says that the rebuke of a friend is sharp, but is good. So we have to build rapport to be able to change those things. And if your friend, or if somebody you just randomly meet decides that they, for example, I had somebody say, they asked me what religion I was. I said, I'm a Christian. They said, well, what religion though? What denomination? And I said, well, we're Baptist. And they went off on Baptists. And rather than me argue with them about how great Baptists are, I said, some of us are grumpy. I mean, and that's true. I'm not lying about that. There are some Baptists who are awful and grumpy, and they're just awful to be around. And I said, yeah. And because I readily admitted that, but I didn't say this person was wrong. I didn't say they were 100% right either. I said, yeah, there are lots of grumpy Baptists. Absolutely. That immediately squashed the whole conversation. And then it offered itself an opportunity to talk about some of the Baptists who are not grumpy, who are not going to go to your house and bang on your door and protest your funeral and tell you that you're a heathen that's going to burn in hell. Not all of us do that, and admit that. And I had a great conversation with that person, despite the fact that initially they were ready to fight, verbally ready to fight. But just by admitting it, that they were right, listening to their complaints, then once I earned the right by listening, I earned the right to speak. And then I just offered a couple of anecdotes that would say, well, I mean, here I am listening to you. I'm a Baptist. And so at the end of the conversation, the guy said to me something along the lines of, this guy over here, this grumpy, angry, protesting Baptist who was calling everybody, literally was calling people whores and using derogatory homosexual slang and yelling at people. And I was right there. He said, that guy is a piece of garbage, basically. He says, but you give me hope. He said, I've never met a Christian like you. You give me hope. Wouldn't it be awesome to have that response from every non-Christian? Anyway, that's it. You guys have a great week. Enjoy your time. I'm going to call my son and congratulate him on his passing his driver's test, or his paper driver's test for the first time. But you guys feel free to ask me any questions you have. You know where I'm at. And read the next 2 chapters for next week. And I'll see you on Sunday. All right, you guys. God bless you and have a great week.